Good evening. Good evening and welcome. This is a Plato and Deleuze, Free University of Brighton philosophy course. If you're in the Free University of Brighton, and if you're in the Free University of Brighton, you should know River. If you're in the Free University of Brighton, then we'll have our seminar on River at 8 p.m. If you're not in the Free University of Brighton, then there is a Discord channel that you're welcome to chat in or ask questions in. That's available. A link is available via the Discord. Tonight I'm going to continue chatting a little bit about dialectic and learning, but I'm going to start by talking about different forms of interpretation that we can find, different ways in which Plato can be read. That's loud enough. That seems loud enough, doesn't it? So yeah, that's the first thing we're going to do, is talk a little bit about that. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll begin to look at the Deleuze interpretation. So we're going to try and sort of locate the way in which Deleuze reads Plato within a wider horizon of interpretations, a wider horizon, a wider sort of set of ways in which Plato is read. After then, we'll have a little break. After the little break, we'll talk, as I say, we'll talk about the Deleuze interpretation. So let's begin. Let's begin by thinking a little bit about the different kinds of interpretations that there are. Let's bring that up for you so you can see that. And I'm going to take a distinction, a threefold distinction that you can find in a book by Ralkowski on Heidegger and Plato, but this is not just unique to Ralkowski. This is a distinction you can find relatively commonly. So these are three different ways in which Plato can be read. The dogmatic or the way, the holistic way, and the esoteric way. So with dogmatists, the idea is I mean, this is a terrible word for it, isn't it? Because it sounds derogatory, dogmatists. But the idea is just that there is a kind of dogma. There is the idea that Plato has a system. There is something we might, in other words, call Platonism, or a Platonic philosophy, or a Platonic system of understanding the world. And the dogmatists will argue that this is a fairly, I suppose, common sense interpretation. You read something like Plato's dialogues and you think, well, he must be saying something. And so the next step is you try and clarify exactly what it is you think he's saying. And this is a fairly reasonable it's a fairly reasonable reading, a fairly reasonable interpretation, don't get me wrong, but it presupposes, in a sense, the idea of a system. It presupposes that what a philosopher is doing, particularly when they write down their thoughts, is presenting one aspect in each particular bit of writing, if you like, presenting something that is coherent as a whole. Now this is kind of that's a more curious presupposition. It was particularly strong in the late 18th and early 19th century, so around the time of Kant and Hegel, at the time at which the idea of a philosophy was that it had to kind of be a complete picture of the world. It has to be able to give you a complete metaphysical understanding of the world, albeit at a broad scale. And so the idea of a system is something that kind of kicks around, and it still kicks around inside philosophy, but it was very, very important in the sort of, as I say, late 18th, early 19th century. And it was, I suppose, something that when we talk about a system, when we talk about a content, we're not just talking about specific little arguments. What we're trying to do is sort of work out how each particular piece complements another piece, and from that kind of setting together of various different elements, what the overall picture is that we're given by a particular philosopher. Now, in terms of the dogmatists, they think, as I say, Plato was a metaphysician with a system. Central to that system was things like the dualism of appearance and essence, which we've talked about a little bit in the previous week. So appearance and essence, these are kind of separate distinct things. Appearance is the world of becoming, the world of change, the world that is transitory, the world that is sensory as well. It's the world we encounter with our everyday 5 normal senses. But it's not real. Or rather, it's just appearance. It's mere appearance. When we say it's not real, we might think that it's unreal, but we don't mean that. We mean that it's a kind of it's a kind of illusion. Now, this is the cave. So the appearance is that stuff that's projected onto the cave. So if you remember the myth of the cave, the allegory of the cave, the idea is that you're kind of trapped. The world is going on behind your head and is being projected. Shadows are being projected, and so you're seeing a kind of shadow of the world. And obviously we don't think of shadows as unreal, but they're in a kind of appearance of the person in relationship to the sun, but we wouldn't take the shadow to be the reality. And so it's the same kind of thing. The appearance, the shadows, these are becomings, these things change, they're transitory, they move, they're encountered through our senses, and they're distinct from the world that is real, the world of essence. Sometimes the words being, essence is being, essence is reality, essence is eternal, essence is intelligible. So we've got a whole series of different kind of dualisms here. Appearance and essence is the same dualism as becoming and being, or change, change and transitory versus the eternal, sensory versus the intelligible. And in the world of essence, we also have this kind of crucial word that I haven't really mentioned yet, but becomes very, very important for people like Heidegger and Derrida, and this is the word ousia, O-U-S-I-A. Let's bring this up just so I can make it clear for you. This word here, ousia, this one. This is the Greek. Now it has its own kind of specific meaning in a sense. Substance, essence, presence, being. It's a slightly difficult word to translate, and has caused enormous sort of difficulties because of that in philosophy. But that's a core element of what the dogmatists would think of as Plato's system, this dualism of appearance and essence. Now, the other aspect of the dogmatists is that essence is encountered, obviously through the intellect. It's partly a kind of, something seen through the intellect, seen as through it's the intelligible world, so it's seen through reason, it's seen through thinking, reasoning, rationality. But the way in which it's seen is through forms. And so we have a dualism of appearance and essence itself is given to us in terms of forms. Whereas appearance is given to us via participation in the forms. So we have this distinction, appearance, essence, and we have appearances are things that participate in the essence that's given in the form. And so appearances, as it were, look like things. I mean, that's the kind of crucial way of thinking about it, is appearances look like things. The things they look like are the real things, the essences, and these real things, the essences, are forms. And the third element, let's say, there are obviously other elements, but the third element that we can clearly identify the dogmatists thinking, Plato has as part of his system, is the idea that humans are in both of these worlds. This is kind of crucial, actually. Human beings live in between, or in both worlds, in the world of appearance and in the world of essence. In a sense, we only live in the world of appearance because we are fallen. And the myth at the centre of the Phaedrus, the myth of the chariots and the myth of the chariot race across the heavens, is a myth of this kind of falling into the sensory, falling into the world, falling away from the intelligible into the world, into being embodied. And within this sort of situation of being fallen, within the situation of being in the world of appearances, what Plato suggests is that it's love, or the power of eros, that drives us back towards the essence, drives us back up towards the heavens. And this is one of the other reasons that in the Phaedrus love is a central theme. It's not just, although it obviously is, it's not just the dealings between Lysias and Phaedrus. It's not just the dealings between the lover and the non-lover being best or not. These are the appearance. This is an appearance, in terms of the conversation in the Phaedrus about love. This is the appearance of the conversation, but behind that there's part of this, the essence of the conversation, if you like, the reality of the conversation, which is, putting forward this relationship to love, to eros, as the driving force that drives us back towards essence from our fallen state. Now, the minute we mention that word fallen, we can kind of hear the Christian. We can kind of hear the Neoplatonic and the Christian in the background there coming in quite strongly. Now, obviously, like all things in philosophy, this is a standard way of doing things. It's not my favourite way, but it's fairly standard. There are interpretations, and then there are problems within each interpretation. So let's just go through the problems with the dogmatic interpretation. So the main problems with the dogmatic interpretation, and I've briefly alluded to this previously, are that the dialogues are inconsistent, that they don't present the system. There is inconsistency between elements. So rather than being kind of part of a complementary whole that produces a system, the argument would be, no, in fact, there are strong inconsistencies, so they can't possibly form a system because it's internally contradictory or it's internally at war with itself. And the most common location for the central inconsistency is the work The Parmenides, which is read, and it's a bit difficult not to really like this, but although it is a very difficult text to read, it's a very, very strange book. But the Parmenides is read as an attack on the theory of forms. And so the idea is that if we are to say, as the dogmatists might, that Plato has a systematic philosophy, and that a key element of that systematic philosophy is this theory of the forms, then this makes no sense when we look at the Parmenides, where in fact what we find is the idea of forms being attacked and destroyed. There is also what we call the earlier dialogues, the aporetic dialogues. Aporia means without passage, and aporia is a bit like paradox. It's not quite the same. There is an important distinction, but we don't need to worry about that at the moment. So an aporia that's Aporia, aporia. An aporia is a situation where you can't go any further, and you kind of have a contradiction, or you kind of have two moments, two positions, neither of which can be in agreement, but both of which seem to be true, both of which seem to be compelling. And the earlier dialogues are often called aporetic because they destroy rather than construct. So the role of the Socratic dialogue in those earlier dialogues appears to be to take away knowledge, to break down the idea that you know what you're thinking. And these earlier dialogues are often concerned with the virtues as well, rather than as perhaps the later dialogues are with knowledge or ontology, knowledge and the way in which the world is, if you like. The earlier dialogues are more often concerned with things called virtues. And it's in those earlier dialogues that we get that classic Socratic moment in which we have the idea that Socrates says something like, "I know that I know nothing." Now this is a kind of aporia because obviously it's kind of a weirdly paradoxical situation, knowing nothing but knowing that you know nothing. These are kind of they're kind of in tension with each other, which is what we encounter in an aporia. And so these two reasons suggest that Plato doesn't have a systematic metaphysics. The earlier dialogues have a different kind of method, a different kind of process. They're destructive rather than constructive, and the later dialogues, like Parmenides, actually, actively argue against a particular position, like the forms. One response the dogmatists might give, of course, and do, is that the systematic views that they ascribe to Plato are developed over time. And so that there are bound to be inconsistencies, And the dogmatists will argue, if we pay attention to the way in which Plato's views develop, we can begin to see, the system being sort of refined and honed, and subtle shifts as it becomes clearer in Plato's own mind what he's doing. Now that sounds like a reasonable. I mean, it's something that happens fairly commonly in the readings and interpretation of a philosopher. You'll often come across things like early and late distinctions, or early, middle, late distinctions, and so you'll find people talking about, let's say Wittgenstein, you talk about the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, or the later Wittgenstein of the Philosophical Investigations, and it's clear that Wittgenstein has a different opinion in his later work than he does in his earlier work, but it's also clear that Wittgenstein isn't really developing a systematic philosophy. But similarly, you might look at someone like Husserl, Edmund Husserl, who clearly is trying to develop a systematic philosophy in the form of phenomenology. And again, you might find differences between the earlier work, the Logical Investigations, and some of the later work, and these differences might be written down as kind of developmental differences. Things changed over time as the system got refined. Now, when it comes to someone like Husserl, that's kind of plausible, because we know when things are published, we know enough biographical and historical information to kind of give a timeline. So it's easy enough for us to work out, what came before what, which book came before another book, as it were. That's not so easy. The response might be when it comes to Plato, because it's really not clear. There's no secure foundation upon which we can give an account of which text, which dialogue came first. And so the idea that the systematic views are being developed over time, is the response would go just question begging, because you don't know which one came first, and so you're kind of reconstructing and you're putting dialogues into your historical timeline according to the system that you think is there. So there are definitely problems with the dogmatic interpretation, but having said that, it's without doubt the dominant interpretation, dominant position in reading Plato. Now the second position, remember I said there were three, so there's the dogmatists, which you just looked at, there's the holists, and then there's the esoterists, or esoteric reading. So let's just look at the holists. Now, holists is just a way of referring to the fact that this interpretation has an emphasis on reading the dialogues as a whole. Now, what do I mean by as a whole? I don't mean reading every single dialogue all in, a big, mess. What I mean is each dialogue is taken to be not just an appearance that has a real content behind it, but rather each dialogue is, seen to be a kind of presentation in which every single part is important. And so the way in which it's presented is as important as what is being presented. And this is much more like a literary reading of Plato, in which we take the characters and the settings and the techniques of presentation to be as important as the specific arguments that we find. Now, this reading was quite a radical break in some ways in the late 18th, early 19th century, and its origins are in someone called Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and he begins to develop this literary, artistic, holistic reading of Plato. He is still, however, very system-orientated. And Schleiermacher has this amazing view that he thinks that Plato somehow came up with his philosophical system completely formed before he began to write anything down, and so that therefore what we can do is, as it were, reconstruct all the dialogues as a way of us being taken on a kind of journey through a whole series of positions to be able to be taught the system. And in order to do that, some of the bits that need to be taught have to be shown rather than said, as it were. We have to be kind of experience them, and so that kind of holistic reading that Schleiermacher offers is still system orientated. Now, nowadays we again have holistic readings, and these will focus on every element, so characters, setting, and techniques. When we were looking at the Phaedrus, one of the things I said right at the start is pay attention to where it's located. It's located, for example, outside of the city. It's located in nature. It's located by a river. Pay attention to, the kind of techniques that are being used, the irony moments. Pay attention to who's involved in it. In this case, it's just Phaedrus and Socrates at the river talking in the Phaedrus, but obviously there's Lysias in the background, and then there's various other people that came up when they start talking about rhetoric later on. And each of these elements, including the myth in particular, becomes just as important as any other. And what we find in that situation is that if we add in those elements, if we read a dialogue as a whole, then often what's going on can become a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex. The easiest example of this is, for example, in the Phaedrus, where we end up towards the end with an argument that basically says something like, writing is a bad way of trying to teach philosophy, but this argument is within a text that's obviously a written form of teaching philosophy. So you have this kind of tension between an argument that's made in the text and the form of the text. Now that's a little bit crude, but that's basically one of the things that the holistic reading can offer us, is these complications between the staging and the setting of a text, particularly when it comes into tension with some of the things that are being said explicitly. Now there are, however, problems. Obviously, as I said, this is the way we do it. There are problems with the holistic interpretation, and the main problem with the holistic interpretation is, let's say, that it can't give us any consistency. There doesn't seem to be any kind of consensus formed, and so what we end up with, generally speaking, is a holistic reading tends to be a skeptical reading. It tends to demolish the content, or at least complicate content of arguments within a dialogue. The other thing that's difficult about a holistic reading is that it's very difficult, or if not impossible, to attribute to Plato the views within the dialogue, because he's not in the dialogue. It's a series of characters, and the views, strictly speaking, should be attributed to the character. Plato becomes an author in this way, rather than a philosopher in some sense. And no more than we can attribute the character's views to an author can we attribute anything to Plato. That would be the problem. So we wouldn't say, of one of the characters in a Shakespeare play that's what Shakespeare necessarily thinks. And so the same problem in a Platonic dialogue. How are we able to say that this is what Plato necessarily thinks of one of his characters? And so the difficulty with the holistic interpretation, at least this is what the dogmatists might say, is that it doesn't give us anything. It doesn't give us any concrete, solid, actual philosophy. It just gives us a way of knocking down various kind of dogmatic interpretations of Plato. It gives us a kind of skeptical response that doesn't really give us much more. So let's just move to the third form of interpretation. And I mentioned this briefly at the end of last week. This is the esoteric interpretation. Now, esoteric has that strange idea of being connected to something like mysticism, magic, religion, all these kind of things, occultism, etc., etc. And there is a relationship to that, without a doubt, particularly a kind of relationship to religion, religious spirituality, these kind of things. But really, we also have to bear in mind that it's just a kind of inside-outside distinction. And this inside, because it means literally inside the walls. That's what the esoteric means, and the exoteric outside the walls. So you can think of them, as that which is outside the walls is written, anyone can get hold of this, and that which is inside the walls is oral. It's the oral teachings of the academy. It's the kind of things that might go on inside a seminar, and something similar happens, for example, in this course. There are public lectures here that are kind of an exoteric part of the course, and then there is a seminar that I don't record for the Free University people that's a kind of esoteric moment. Now, obviously, what's really meant is, in a sense, that there's something hidden. That's the real kind of background to the esoteric interpretation, that there is something inside the walls that can't be put into writing, maybe can't be put into writing in principle, Not just hasn't been put into writing, and that there's something that needs to have a dialogue in person, or something that can't be said and can only be shown. There's some element, the esoteric interpretation will argue, there's some element involved in Plato's work that has to be kind of uncovered. The essence of Plato's work is esoteric and hidden. Now, this particular esoteric interpretation is very strongly involved in what we call Neoplatonism. So this is Plotinus, and importantly, the kind of one of the foundations or background foundations of contemporary Christianity. Neoplatonism and Christianity kind of are this really intensely interwoven mixture. Now, it still, however, has a contemporary moment. So Neoplatonism occurs, let's say, I mean, this is not quite right, but this is roughly 250 to 500 AD, and that Neoplatonism is kind of dominant then for a long period of time. There's a change with Schleiermacher at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, where we have the beginning of the holistic interpretation. And then we kind of, begin to reach a series of modern moments. But at the time of Schleiermacher, who's, trying to have this holistic interpretation, but still thinking that Plato has a full system, there's this really interesting moment with a contemporary of his called Schlegel. These are great names, aren't they? Schleiermacher and Schlegel. So Schlegel versus Schleiermacher. Now, one of the things that goes on here is Schlegel is basically very, very closely involved in this development of an esoteric interpretation, a new form of an esoteric interpretation that isn't strictly speaking Neoplatonic, but is in kind of response to Schleiermacher and his idea of like reading Plato as a literary work, if you like. And one of the things that Schlegel says is that Plato used the dialogue, the form of the dialogue, because it allowed him to mirror man's fragmented, partial and finite grasp of the infinite. And so in other words, what Schlegel is kind of sort of putting here is that in the process of going through the dialogues, we experience the fragmentary relationship we have to the infinite that's being presented in those dialogues. And so that experience is a kind of teaching moment. And so esoteric interpretations often have this relationship to kind of something like a teaching moment, something like an inner wisdom moment, so an experience of knowledge rather than a presentation of knowledge. And this experiential element to the esoteric interpretations has a contemporary kind of appearance in what we call philosophical counselling. And so there's a person called Pierre Grimes, for example, and for those of you in FUB and on River, I'm going to put up a couple of little videos of Pierre Grimes, in particular his video on the myth of the Phaedrus, where he discusses the myths in the Phaedrus. But for those of you who are not in River, then you can find these links through my YouTube channel. It's on one of my playlists there. I have a Plato and Deleuze playlist, research notes playlist. You can find the Pierre Grimes video there. And Pierre Grimes sort of develops this notion of counselling based upon Platonic dialogues, and we can find this, much more widespread, the idea of Socratic dialogue as a kind of counselling moment, in which the idea is that what the dialogues are doing is taking you through an experience, a kind of therapeutic experience. And so that's the kind of contemporary way in which a lot of this esoteric interpretation might be encountered. In essence, this esoteric interpretation talks about, in a sense, the experience that is encountered through going through the dialogues and through that kind of Socratic questioning process. So those three interpretations, the dogmatic, the holistic, the esoteric. The dogmatic, there is a system of content. The holistic, things have to be read as artistic and literary wholes. The esoteric, there has to be an experience involved of the core of what Plato is saying. These different forms of interpretation, essentially these are ways in which we would, to use Plato's dialectic, collect things together. Collect together the way in which different people speak about Plato and divide them up. And so as well, so there's that three different moments. And it's within the context of those three different moments that I want to begin to talk a little bit about the way in which Deleuze reads Plato. But I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and you should too. You should stretch your legs, have something to drink, or just, just have a moment to not be listening to something. So it's 7:30 at the moment, and I'll be back at 7:35.
Everybody get up, it's the party song. Everybody get up, it's a party song.
Okay, welcome back. Part 2 of this lecture. Chat through about Deleuze and Plato. That's probably more accurate. So there's that quote. I used this last week, and I just wanted to bring it back up again, because what I want to do for the last section of this session today is just talk a little bit about Deleuze's interpretation in the context of those other interpretations that I've just mentioned: the dogmatic, the holistic, and the esoteric. And the quote I put up last week has this line from Deleuze: "The idea is not the element of knowledge, but that of an infinite learning," in inverted commas, "which is of a different nature to knowledge." And I think this is going to speak to the way in which the Deleuze interpretation kind of begins to do something different from the other interpretations. So first of all, this idea that Deleuze is talking about here, this is the essence, the form. These are the big parts of Plato, the content that we commonly encounter when we are sort of told about Platonism. Oh yeah, Plato's forms, the idea of justice, the idea of truth, the idea of beauty, etc., etc. The form of truth, the form of justice, the form of beauty. So idea and form are used kind of interchangeably. And within Plato, what we're trying to do is go from our experiences of various different things in the world, and all of which are changeable, transitory, and it's sort of slightly messy. And we're trying to work out how to see the patterns, see the commonalities and differences, work out the way in which the world really is. And so the idea is used in Plato as a kind of model from which there are copies. And the things we see in the world, as I say, are like shadows, copies of this original, this model. And this model, this is eternal, this is the reality, this is the essence. It's posited as outside, massively outside of the world of appearance. And then Plato has to kind of establish how we're going to know this, how the appearances participate in the idea, and a whole series of other difficulties, all of which arise out of an initial impulse, which was to try and work out what's shared, what's in common between things that look quite different, between the appearances in front of us. So human beings, for example, there's a huge range of different types of human beings, different ways in which we present, all sorts of variety here. And so what is it that would, as it were, be common to all, if anything? Now that question isn't really asked sometimes, if anything. But let's say, what's common to all? And what's common to all is going to be the idea of the human. And somehow each human is going to participate to a greater or lesser extent in this idea. And the better we do, the better we aim at the good, the better we aim at the idea, the better we are as a human being, the more virtuous, etc., etc., the more we should, as it were, know the world around us. And so the idea is a kind of organising principle in some sense, but it's eternal, it's fixed, and it's got this completely different kind of existence from appearances. Now what Deleuze wants to do, this is the absolute fundamental grounding in a sense, is get rid of anything that's outside. Get rid of what's called transcendence and keep everything immanent. So it's a huge distinction that Deleuze tries to make all the way through his work inside philosophy, between philosophies of transcendence and philosophies of immanence. And we'll try and talk a little bit more about that, so don't worry too much about the terms at the moment. So what Deleuze wants to do is not reject, in a sense, what Plato's done in producing these kind of ideas, but in particular in producing this movement from particulars to a general form, from the appearances to something real that they have in common. He doesn't want to reject that, but he wants to rethink it, rework it on the basis of it all being put into one sort of space, all being put into one field, if you like. that's kind of interrelated, rather than having this moment outside, this moment like God outside, that's transcendent. And so for Deleuze, the idea is not an eternal form that is then participated in by appearances, which is how Plato is commonly read, and perhaps even how Plato himself fairly clearly understood it at certain points. But instead, Deleuze wants to kind of argue that there's been a mistake made there as well as an advance, and that the idea is, as he says, an element of learning rather than knowledge. So the idea is a kind of motivational practice, a kind of, I mean, it's not quite the right way of thinking of it. It's a kind of aim that arises, that organises our encounters with appearance. And so the idea becomes something like an organising principle. And one of the things we've seen in recent sort of philosophy, by which I mean in the last century, is an increasing encounter with the idea that ideas change. Ideas have histories and what are called genealogies, and that what was understood by an idea, let's say, of being, or an idea of the human at one point, is actually quite different from what's understood by that idea of being or the human, let's say, at another point. And so that whilst we might find that we share the name, an idea shares a name between one point and another, in fact the content, as it were, has changed. But what Deleuze wants to say is that content isn't inside the idea, it's to do with its effects, it's to do with the way in which it organises the kind of things that can be said and the kind of things that we can learn. An example of this, we might want to think about the idea of the human and what it's distinct from, what it's kind of opposed to, what is the not human. Now, at one point in particular around the idea of Plato and earlier philosophy, then we might say is that the human is distinct from the animal, and that the human is a rational being as distinct from the irrational animal, and they're kind of, things that aren't humans are animals, perhaps plants and stuff, but let's talk about, sentient and active creatures. So amongst those, we can distinguish between those that are human, those that aren't, and those that aren't are beasts, animals. And so the idea of the human is kind of organising distinctions. It's organising ways we encounter other entities, other human entities and other non-human entities. And it's kind of organising the way we can make and see differences in the world. Whereas when we move to the modern age, and by the modern age I'm talking, let's say, 1500s onwards, sort of up to the Renaissance, Enlightenment beginnings, that kind of thing. So when we move to that kind of age, what we begin to increasingly see, perhaps, is the idea that the human is no longer distinguished primarily against the animal or against the beast. It's now much more primarily distinguished against the machine. And so the idea of the human now reorganises the way in which we see distinctions, and so now the problem is not are you behaving like an animal, you're no longer human, you're behaving like an animal, which might be the earlier form, but now it's you're no longer human, you're behaving like a machine. Now each of those kind of ideas is a kind of idea of the human, and it's using kind of distinctions and differences, and it's organising those across a kind of, let's say, field of connections. And this, I think, is, and we're going to develop this idea, this, I think, is what Deleuze is fundamentally trying to do. He's trying to retain some of the movement that takes place inside Plato. This movement from the empirical, the experiential, the sensory, to a kind of collection moment, if you like, to this moment of what's shared and what's general, what the pattern is. He's trying to retain that but at the same time remove the transcendence, remove this idea of an eternal transcendence. So when we look at Deleuze, that kind of orientating principle around ideas can give us a sense of what he's trying to do, but we need to be a little bit more specific, perhaps. Now, Deleuze has, in a recent text that was published called Letters and Other Texts, he has this lovely moment in there where he's writing to a friend called Arnaud Verlaine, and on page 86 we find him describing something quite useful for us. What he describes is the elements that need to exist if... And he's talking about he's talking to Vellény about Vellény's publishing agenda, what Vellény wants to write. And Deleuze says, well, if you're going to write something, you have to kind of think of what's a good book, if you like. And he uses this notion, worthy. What's worthy of being made into a book? At what point, in other words, should you say something rather than just keep quiet? And if you want to say something, if you want to write a book, if you want to present something, then you should think of 3 different elements, Deleuze says, when you're talking about, in particular, other philosophers. 1, he says, what's the error or the problem in the philosophy that you're looking at? 2, he says, what's been forgotten? What can you sort of bring to the field that's been forgotten when other people are talking about it? And 3, what can you create from this? And so these 3 elements of what's the error you've identified? What do you think has been forgotten in what other people have said? And what can you create? If you can answer those 3 elements, according to Deleuze, these form criteria of what would make a good book. So let's just do that in terms of Deleuze's reading of Plato. Now, obviously, Deleuze didn't write a book on Plato, so he never quite got to that point of thinking he could write a completely worthy book on Plato, but he did write lots about Plato in different places. And so we're kind of reconstructing a little bit, but let's have a look. So the error, or the problem, is this thing I was just talking about, transcendence. This is, in Deleuze, often referred to as the judgment of God. And this is a phrase that originates within Antoninato, at least in terms of Deleuze. So that's the error or the problem he's identifying within Plato, this transcendence, the judgment of God, this moment at which we have this kind of infinite intellect that is completely in touch with the forms, and that the human that's fallen is always kind of missing something there. So this is the error, that we need the forms, we need the judgment of God. What's forgotten, and I've mentioned this term a number of times, is selection. So in the dialectic, the way in which Plato presents it, the way in which Socrates talks about it, is as a process of division and collection. And what's forgotten, Deleuze seems to continually put forward this notion of selection. What's actually going on in the dialectic is not just division and collection, it's division and collection in order to select from contenders. And so we see this in terms of the Phaedrus. Who's the better candidate for your love, the lover or the non-lover? Who's a better candidate for your love? The person who's got divine madness connected into their love, or the person who's nice and rational and safe. The process here is there in the question, who's the better one? It's to select out. And similar things will occur all the way through. When we begin to move to the sophist, this is what we find in the sophist, this process of selection, very, very clearly as the sort of point or the purpose of the dialectic. So the error is transcendence or the judgment of God. What's been forgotten is this importance of selection. And what's created is, for Deleuze, this thing he calls difference in itself. And he begins to develop this in difference and repetition. And it's this kind of movement away from identity to emphasizing the importance of difference, and in particular difference that's not dependent upon identity. Now, in a short essay, it's only 4 paragraphs. It's not even an essay at this point. I think it's when it was published, it was called Remarks. In a short piece of text, let's say, by Deleuze, called Plato the Greeks, which we can find in Essays Critical and Clinical, we can begin to see some of these things in a little bit more detail. So here we can find this phrase, and this sort of talks about, as I say, the error that we might locate Deleuze as finding in Plato. And so Deleuze says the poisoned gift of Platonism is to have introduced transcendence into philosophy. And this bit's important, to have given transcendence a plausible philosophical meaning, the judgment of God. Now so it's not just that Plato sort of began to talk about transcendence, it's that he made it so compelling, is that he presented it in such a way that it seemed as though we couldn't avoid it. And so the error in a sense is not just in talking about transcendence or having a transcendent element within his philosophy, the forms, the eternal ideas. It's not just about having that that transcendent element. It's about the production of a philosophy that drives you towards that transcendent element as a conclusion, as a kind of compelling result of the arguments. So the poisoned gift of Platonism is to have introduced transcendence into philosophy, to have given transcendence a plausible philosophical meaning. It's interesting that he uses plausible there. It's not that it's correct, but that it's compelling. It makes sense. It draws on some kind of conception we already have, some kind of maybe intuition about the world, something that sort of feels comfortable, and Platonism, as it were, pushes into that, and draws out of that this compulsion to think that there must be something like the form, there must be something like a universal, there must be something like an idea, and resisting it becomes, a form of skepticism. You don't necessarily have an alternative. So that's the error. In terms of the forgotten, as I said, this role of the selection is kind of crucial. But the selection role depends upon or arises from the location of Plato's work within the political context, within the human political context, in particular within the context of cities and the city of Athens. But what I mean by that is within the context of an environment in which people are in competition, not in a capitalist sense, but people are in competition. There are rival candidates for things. Politics, as we kind of think of it, exists, and this is very, very clear when we look at the Phaedrus. We can see this kind of background very clearly in the myth of when he talks about the myth of the cicadas. Halfway through, what you find is him dropping rapidly into a conversation and discussion about politics, about what we might call now fake news and political spin, these kind of things. And that kind of notion of selection obviously we're facing at the moment, as I'm talking here, the Americans are facing an election in which that's the point, it's selection. Which candidate, are you going to choose? And there's arguments behind that about, some people don't want to choose any of these candidates, but, but that point of selection kind of organises the rest of the debate. If someone is a left-winger who doesn't like Biden, presumably, Joe Biden is a kind of irrelevancy most of the time, and they wouldn't have to be, questioned about whether they, should or should not support him in most of the moments. But at the point of selection, then the question becomes, will you select this or that? Not what do you think, but what will you select? And this is a kind of crucial political, contextual purpose that motivates Plato's dialogues. And so Plato's dialogues are not, in this sense, selection is not about just indicating that there's this abstract process going on. It's indicating that there's politics and force and power relationships kicking away in the background. In terms of the created, let's just look at that a little bit more. Oops, click the right button, that might help. There we go. So in terms of the created, as I said, this is Deleuze's attempt to develop a notion of difference. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but let's just try and think about the difference between two different forms of questions. What is something? This is a kind of Socratic question. What is something? What's the definition of something? And what difference does something make? When we ask what is something, we're pushed into a kind of answer. That question organises a kind of answer that we can give. When we ask what difference does it make, what difference does that thing make, is there a difference? Is there a difference between Biden and Trump, for example? Well, yes, there is going to be a difference made in some sense, but so instead of asking about, what is it that Biden really is, or what is it that Trump really is, what we might ask is, what difference does it make if you select one rather than the other? Sorry, Susie, if it's buffering. They might need to just press F5 and try and refresh. And so that's the thing that Deleuze wants to push forward there in this try notion of the difference. And we're going to move in the rest of the course from the Phaedrus to the Sophist, as from next week. And in the Sophist, there's this huge focus on non-being, and in particular on this very strange notion of the non-being of non-being. You know, if something doesn't have any being, then how can you even talk about it not having any being? It doesn't have enough being to even begin to refer to it. And in that dialogue, the Sophist, there's a transformation that takes place in relationship to the sense of non-being. It changes its sense, and Deleuze wants to argue that it changes its sense from a kind of a question or a problem organised around identity, what something is, to a question organised around selection and difference. What difference does something make? And so that difference, that kind of distinction between what is something and what difference does something make, that's kind of the thing that we want to begin to explore. And one of the things that's crucial about the Sophist, and one of the reasons we're going to be looking at it, is because it's in that text that Deleuze wants to use Plato to undermine Plato, or in particular more to use Plato to undermine Plato's transcendence. And so here we will find and we'll begin to see the way in which the idea has this organising function. The idea is not outside and participated in, it's rather inside and organising the kind of things we can say about, say, truth, justice, beauty, etc. Now I'm going to move to the seminar in about 5 minutes, and we're going to just leave it there for now. So I'm just going to skip over just for next week. What we need to do in terms of the course is begin now to read the Sophist and read this very curious text. Now, as I say, the Sophist is going to present this kind of transformation process, a transformation in our sense of non-being. And it's going to encounter this very difficult question that it can't really answer, between what's the difference between a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and a sophist. So it's time to begin reading that text, but we're also going to start now also bringing in some of the Deleuze texts specifically as we go through, because a lot of Deleuze's conversations and discussions on Plato often reference the Sophists, so we can begin to kind of quite closely connect the two things now. And so for the seminar reading for next week, we're going to be looking at the Deleuze text Plato, the Greeks. But that's it for today. Thank you to Machinadas if you're around for the parcel that you sent down. That was brilliant. I hope you're feeling better if you catch up with us later. I hear hope you've got COVID. I hope your COVID isn't too terrible. For everyone else who's facing lockdown, just try and be as safe and sane as you can be, and if you need to get in touch through Discord or share something or come along, then do so, and hopefully we can read Plato together in the middle of the lockdown. And for everybody else who's there from Free University Brighton, I will see you on in Zoom in about 5 minutes. For everyone else, thank you very much.